With this, I officially open the Recreate Conference with the opening plenary, appropriately titled Setting the Stage, Overviews, and Precedents. And the aim of this plenary is to draw out the threads of theory, method, and practice that will guide the overall Recreate Conference over the next 4 days. And we're of course, very happy to have an amazing panel of truly international experts in the conference thematics which will help guide our way. I'm going to introduce the panelists now, and we'll proceed with a statement from each that will last 15 to 20 minutes. We'll have time as we set up between panelists for 1 or 2 questions, and then afterwards we'll have a discussion among the panelists. So it's a round table. It's not going to be moderated. It's more self-moderated, and of course there's a discussion among all of you, and that's hopefully the setup will enable that to happen.
Just get Cheryl over here. She just got
Yeah, so Cheryl Sim should also come up to the table. So the panel consists of Michael Century from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in the United States, and his paper is entitled Pathways to Innovation in Digital Culture Revisited. The second speaker is Louise POISSANT, who is the scientific director of the Fonds de recherche de Québec, Société et Culture, and former professor at UQAM, with her paper Regard transversal sur les pratiques inter et trans. Georgina Bourne from Oxford University, who will focus on transdisciplinary experimentation and ontological change and ethnography of art science. And finally, Gisèle Trudel from UQAM and Cheryl Sim from DHC-Art with, quote, Weaving Strands, Research Creation Practices in Universities, Cultural Institutions, and Artist-Run Culture in Montreal. And without further ado, I introduce you to Michael Century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I have the first slide on the screen? It's an honor to address this session. Thank you, Chris, on precedents and overviews at the outset of this conference. Chris, this is not really a paper so much as a response to a request. The request came from Chris Salter, to my left, to address the science policy entanglements with creation research. This is a standpoint I think has seen little coverage in the Media Art History Conference, despite, as Oliver put, the list of disciplines. Science policy as such is not one that is that I'm aware of has been addressed so much. So I'm happy to do so, especially with these colleagues at the table. I will do so by providing I will provide this perspective by revisiting a report I wrote in 1999 for the Rockefeller Foundation on pathways to innovation in digital culture. A brief personal note, this was at a time in my life when I was actually deeply involved with policy, and one of our aims was to see how the arts and culture sector could become more legible and visible and comprehensible by the science and technology ecosystem. So the report was written during the height of the dot-com boom of the late 1990s for the Rockefeller, headed then by Joan Shigeakawa. The initial question was, what should be the priorities for the media and experimental arts within a foundation whose priorities were medical, basic science research, health. And the background in this foundation was much support in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for the new media of those years, such as video and computer music. You might remember, it's a very funny piece, that Nam June Paik wrote his piece on the electronic superhighway for the Rockefeller Foundation in 1974. So the interest was not only what to support, but why. And my task was to contextualize current media art practices in terms that would make sense to science policy folks. A fairly narrow brief. What were the available ideas from science policy literature that I found useful? Let me just say right now, there's a lot of interconnections between what you're going to hear now and what will be coming in the subsequent talks. The key idea was something, it sounds ugly, I know, but it's something called Mode 2 knowledge production. An idea which is meant to be distinguished from disciplinary traditional research and knowledge production. It was, at the time I was studying this stuff in the 90s, defined in 4 parts. It was seen to be transdisciplinary, not just involving linked fields, but fusing epistemological horizons, that knowledge is produced in practice, that it's applied, not following a rigid linear model which separates the phases of research into basic experimental development and application, that it was heterogeneous, that it involved multiple sites, many actors, patients, users, civil society, not just professional scientists, and that it was reflexive and dealt with the social contextualization of science. So I took away from these ideas, this is the citation for those of you who are interested to know the earliest text that I know of that dealt with this concept. I took away from this notion the idea of the artist as an actor in relation to the emerging media technologies of the time, mainly emphasizing the role the artist could play as a constructive contributor to the realization of the potential of the knowledge economy. In that literature, I found very little then to deal with how artists are deeply involved with creating, designing, and developing technologies as such. Obviously a wide world apart from the Poggioli that you quoted. Very little awareness of those genealogies and connections and histories. I argued in the 1999 report we were seeing emerging, that we were not seeing a merging of art, science, and technology, but rather a growing density of communication between them, and that we should not see the process as one of convergence, as was fashionable then and is still even today, but as one of density of interconnections within a particular hybrid institutional form, what I called the studio laboratory. I located the studio lab as an institutional innovation itself, as a hybrid site where new technologies are co-produced in the context of their creative use. The genealogy, I don't need to go over, going back to the constructivists, the Bauhaus, especially the art tech boom of the 1960s, and I classified them in terms of cultural institutions, standalone places, all the places we know in our community so well, ZKM, IRCOM, Ars Electronica, the Banff Center, business firms, of course Bell Labs and IBM in the 60s, but then places like Xerox PARC, Interval, Canon, NTT in Japan, universities and public national laboratories, MIT, the GMD, etc., and networks such as in the European-wide research networks of the time, the Australian Network for Art and Technology, and temporary and tactical media labs, one-off, punctual, project-based events, not intended to be bricks and mortar sustained institutions. I'm doing this to revisit the report for you to know basically what I did. Then I did a cross-examination of studio labs that were sampled in the report in 5 themes. One was instruments for discovery, the idea of the artwork as a boundary object, interfaces for creative expression, as well as scientific discovery, the co-production of new technologies in use, with the idea of the artist as a lead user, or the idea of the artist as a user to come, computational fluency. What I was trying to do there is go beyond the access paradigm. The talk about just access to tools was rather slender, and I emphasized the importance of new kinds of literacies, computational media fluency, especially in the rise and prevalence of peer-based commons production, the idea of the artist as a contributor to science communication, and finally, under the phrase cultural critique and reflexivity, I describe the value of what I'll call endogenous critical technical practice, interrogating the underlying metaphors and assumptions from within a field, not just in discursive terms, but in material practical terms as well. Also from the science policy literature, I made use of a common 4-part typology of innovation. This is standard: incremental, radical, systemic, and paradigmatic. So this word paradigm is going to get thrown around a lot, and I apologize in advance. The paradigmatic in this literature, the last of these categories, is the idea from economic history that there have been recurring waves. I'm sorry, I missed my slides out of order. There have been recurring waves of innovation going back to in capitalism since the 18th century. The current wave based in digital media, software, and networks rose in the 80s after incubation for several decades. My intent in considering this idea of long waves was to oppose the ideology of the long boom the idea that there would be a kind of infinite prosperity promoted by Silicon Valley trade journals like Wired in the 1990s. In this, I was influenced quite a lot by contact with, I'm sorry that I'm missing my slides up, contact with a author who was one of the initial proponents of the concept of the long wave, which he called techno-economic paradigms. And this author is Christopher Freeman, who with his collaborator Carlotta Perez put forward the idea that with each wave, based on a new energy source, characteristic modes of transportation and communication, particular modes of science, would be the basis for a 40 to 50 year period of diffusion and finally exhaustion, to be followed by another wave. And Freeman had written in 1992 a paper which dealt with a prospective look at a wave after information and communication technologies, which he called a green techno-economic paradigm for the world economy. I'm saying this because this was also in my mind, to think of our wave as not being the end, but one in a series, a recurring pattern. For Freeman, there was no magic wand in this projection. He was no simple technological determinist. The idea of putting these ideas forward was to encourage a political will to think beyond information technologies to a green, sustainable economy. Beyond locating and analyzing the studio lab as a key leverage point, my report concluded by identifying various issues for study, and there were some very interesting follow-ups, the most important of which, also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, was this report, Beyond Productivity, which was a report to the National Academy of Sciences. In service of time, I won't summarize that. Many of you know this report. So, putting all this together, summarizing, in the late 1990s, I found it helpful to use an innovation studies framework to put forward artists as valuable actors in relation to science and technology research infrastructures, emphasizing the rising importance of the long wave of digital media and networks. Revisiting this report and aware that on this panel are people who have great depth, have discussed these issues of transdisciplinarity, I will first acknowledge the limitations of this narrowly innovation policy standpoint. And to complicate it, I want to look at research creation more specifically inside the long wave theory. Let's begin by looking where we are in 2015 in comparison to 1999. Sorry, these got out of order. The quote here is from the director of Ars Electronica Future Lab, Horst Hüttner, in 2007, who wrote, "What could be experienced as a revolution in 1990s, the integration of the digital into all areas of life, is essentially now a completed process. The further development of these technologies is so pervasive that the rapidly successive development cycles simply show evolutionary improvements. Our society's future will, however, continue to be marked by major changes that are first detected by insiders, just as in the time of the digital revolution. Nanotechnology, biotechnology, cognitive science, humanities, and social science have become the new playground for art." All of this well known in our conference and community. So my first point in the revisit is that studio labs in digital media, software, and networks have become pervasive, no longer the exception but the rule. They have been established with a far wider scope of scientific fields and technologies involved. So we've seen a proliferation of centers, programs, and to just name some of the emerging ones that are to include biological, ecological, environmental, and crucially the social sciences, in a movement parallel to the digital-based centering tendencies of the 80s and 90s. So I also would say that the discourse of the artist as innovator is so pervasive that it's become a flat joke when you can look at a slide like this with Steve Jobs standing at the corner of technology and the liberal arts. We can easily remember that what was visionary decades ago has become more than mainstream. My own university, too, has a institute-wide priority called art-scienc to foster linkages between the creative arts and not just one, but all schools and disciplines. The long-wave concept has also become pervasive. Those of you who follow the net time list, for instance, will notice writings on this subject by people like Kostakis Bounds, Brian Holmes, not just in the usual science policy world where you have taken for granted a version of Freeman's green techno-economic paradigm ever more operationalized as people work on green energy, smart grids, peer-based collaborative production. What I want to do next, and I see I only have 4 minutes. Oh dear. What I want to do is complicate the long-wave theory, and I'll do this with, I'll just speak to that because my text is too long, with the idea of multi-temporal dynamics, non-synchronicity. The key idea I want to put out is that within a wave, there is not only the positive or direct innovative involvement with the wave itself, but what I will call the anticipatory dynamic, with the pre-paradigmatic. In our conference, of course, this is canonical. Whenever we write about precursors, Chris did the same today, precursor framing of the art and tech movement from the 60s. Edward Shanken's text on the future and history of the lab is typical. He wrote in 2010 a piece on the future and history of the lab, simply writing about the 1957 Phillips Pavilion and EAT's 9 Evenings of Theater and Engineering. Just recall, however, that also in those years, critics and writers like Jack Burnham and Willem Flusser were also already forecasting the quasi-biological future for art, the future of living artworks, of biotechnics. So that's the pre-paradigmatic dynamic. I now introduce a third and fourth. The post-paradigmatic, where instead of being anticipatory, the work looks back generatively at previous media forms to recontextualize, reinvent, and repurpose older ones. And finally, a fourth temporality that is synchronous with, but contests the assumptions and premises of the current paradigm from within. I call this anti-paradigmatic. I will now briefly compare and contrast examples to try to give this rather abstract last couple of minutes a bit more meat. The first I want to give is familiar to some in this audience. It's 25 years old already. It's a project called the Bioapparatus at the Banff Center, a project I was involved with personally, which, to put it in a brief, long text here, to reduce it, was framed as a critical project for the investigation of virtual environments at that point when the public mythology of what virtual reality would be was up for grabs. In other words, to critique against the grain the military, industrial, and entertainment applications that were driving its laboratory development. The directors of this, Catherine Richards and El Tenhoff, framed this, and I would put the phrase as an anti-paradigmatic project because it was not only critical, but also directly involved with the prototypical uses of VR itself. It involved artists, residents, critical theorists, engineers, designers from academia, as well as the IT industry. It was a highly entangled residency. I'm sure somebody in the audience who was here would agree with that, in the sense that the interests were extremely diverse and did not actually succeed on certain levels of success. The idea of the critical phase was to provide a kind of terrain which would be followed by high-end actual production. And as it turned out, the high-end actual production, a series of fully realized VR artworks, took place under their own production logic and separate from the critical project, and quite separate from the critical project that preceded it. This entanglement of critique and experimental development within the bioapparatus is instructive. And I will just leave it at that point. There's a lot more to say about it. Turning to the present day, it seems we may be moving from a provocative, critical, and ironic period in some of the post-digital art science fields to one that's more clearly characterized by an innovation agenda, much like digital culture was 20 and 25 years ago. And I will now show you this example of a current project in the United States, which involves six art and design schools. It's called the Bio Design Challenge, an appeal to a mix of biologists, artists, and designers, specifically to find better solutions to problems of food, health, medicine, gene therapy through fast emerging fields like synthetic biology. Again, the rationale is collaboration between artists, designers, biologists, engineers as an innovative stimulus for a host of post-digital fields, like I just said, energy, food, basically grand global challenges. The sponsors of this project are the Brooklyn BioArt Lab, GenSpace, the tech giant Autodesk, the Popular Science, a huge popular magazine, science communication magazine, the FBI, I don't know what to say about that, among others. Also, and explicitly, and others. My point about showing you the slide of the Biodesign Challenge, which is in process as we speak, is to say that this idea of sparking innovative problem solving, giving incentives for artists to participate, and finding non-conventional solutions to global challenge is just as clearly legible today, if not more so, than the arguments we were making 2 decades ago for the artist and digital culture. The issue is again, as it was then, how to make a space for provocation, speculation, critique, irony, play, and not just to have those things serve as alternative exotic ingredients feeding into collaborative problem solving. Putting my ancient policy hat back on briefly and then to wrap up, I think we can expect this kind of thing, these kind of bio-design challenges, if we look at this as an emerging type, to grow in a big way in the coming years, primarily because they're so clearly easy to grasp. If stimulus spending for infrastructure comes along, if cultural funding for rethinking what art support is meant to be for, this country, for example, is going to be facing these sorts of priority setting exercises in the coming years. It will be interesting to see, I would predict that the innovative agenda, what I'm calling the innovative agenda, will be the one that sells, and then in certain ways we're in a similar position as we were 20 years ago. That's it for now. I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that very, very interesting overview and trajectory from 1999 to now. Are there just a quick question before we go on to Louise POISSANT? Or a comment from the audience? Yes. We need a mic. Yeah, it's right there.
Hi, I really liked what you had to say, but I'm thinking, and I've heard this in other kinds of reunions with technological art, that there is some professors, for example, that are thinking about what's going on outside the institution, and the mind that is not molded by the institution but has made some exciting discoveries, and how are these searchers that are maybe not in the institution to be integrated? That's my question. How do you integrate this?
How does the independent artist play in these institutional forms? It's a heck of a good question. It's one of the problems of the institutionalization of research creation today. I would call this the problem of porosity or permeability. How can you be permeable? I can only answer on a personal level, and this is ancient history, but independent art centers can be brokers and links. We have these art centers in Montreal, I worked at one, the Banff Center for the Arts. Banff Center is interesting because it's both an independent arts center and also kind of can play the research funding game too, as we found over the years sometimes works. It's difficult without some kind of institutional bridging, is all I can say on your question for now.
Okay, we'll go on. Louise POISSANT from the Fonds de recherche de Québec, Société et Culture.
Bonjour, pendant que je place mon PowerPoint, d'abord dire à quel point je suis heureuse que Montréal ait son édition de Media Art History, Recreate, et que la communauté internationale vienne rencontrer les artistes et les chercheurs montréalais qui sont très engagés depuis plusieurs décennies dans le domaine des arts médiatiques. Un grand merci, Chris et Gisèle, d'avoir rendu ça possible. Évidemment, Oliver aussi, Oliver Graham. J'ai changé plusieurs fois mon titre et je me suis finalement arrêtée sur regard en pointillé parce que j'ai pensé que ça correspondait mieux à ce que j'allais vous présenter aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire une espèce de parcours de ce que j'ai retenu en très peu de temps de l'histoire des arts médiatiques et de leur rencontre avec les autres disciplines et l'intersectorialité. D'abord dire que quand les arts médiatiques ont émergé, ces formes d'art-là arrivaient sur un territoire qui était déjà abondamment occupé par une longue histoire de l'art et par beaucoup de théories et d'histoire des autres formes d'art. Et c'était très difficile, certains parmi vous vous en souvenez sans doute, de faire valoir l'intérêt esthétique et artistique de ces formes d'art qui s'articulaient avec des concepts, des matériaux et surtout des installations tellement différentes de ce qu'on avait l'habitude de connaître dans un domaine qui était déjà hautement saturé. On avait aussi un problème, et ça nous a occupés à un colloque à l'E13. Dommage, Roger, Roy, Eduardo ne sont pas là, mais on était une quinzaine de personnes, et pendant 4 jours à essayer de trouver quel était le terme générique qui correspondrait le mieux pour décrire ou résumer ou ramasser l'ensemble des pratiques des arts médiatiques. Arts médiatiques ne plaisait pas du tout parce que ça faisait référence à télévision et radio, et donc ça ne couvrait pas du tout le champ et le domaine des arts médiatiques. C'était un argument farouche auquel tenait Roy Ascott, que ce ne soit pas art médiatique. Alors moi, j'étais très contente en 2005 de voir apparaître Media Art History parce que ça couvrait bien au-delà de la télévision et de la radio. Bon, il y a eu plusieurs, on peut dire, tentatives et comme je viens de le dire, le Media Art était pour moi, je crois, une très bonne idée. Il y a eu très vite une espèce d'explosion des formes d'art reliées aux médias et aux technologies, une très grande prolifération qui d'ailleurs n'est pas finie, puisque je dirais que chaque mois naissent d'autres formes d'art qui interpellent d'autres médiums, d'autres relations, d'autres objets d'étude, d'autres méthodologies. J'ai mis en blanc bioart parce que parmi l'ensemble des formes d'art que j'avais retenues là, rien que bioart, c'est comme d'ailleurs toutes ces autres formes d'art-là, se sont elles-mêmes démultipliées et développées en toute une série de spécialisations et de formes d'approches artistiques avec des méthodologies qui leur sont propres. J'ai beaucoup interpellé Nicolescu pour cette présentation parce que, comme vous le savez sans doute, c'est un grand spécialiste de la transdisciplinarité. Et j'ai aimé en particulier cet énoncé, lorsque le regard change, lorsque le regard change, non, lorsque le regard, porté sur le monde, lorsque le regard change sur le monde change, excusez-moi. Et effectivement, pour que ce regard change, il faut souvent de nouveaux instruments. Ces nouveaux instruments ouvrent de nouveaux niveaux de perception, de nouvelles façons de voir, et ces nouvelles façons de voir permettent de réinventer le monde, de le transformer. À la suite d'un colloque autour de Godard, j'ai eu l'occasion de pouvoir écouter les 13 heures d'entrevue que Alain Fléchère, un grand ami, a fait avec Jean-Luc Godard. Et Jean-Luc Godard, dans ces 13 heures-là, dit quelque part combien certains outils, certains instruments ont permis de transformer la vision. Il parle de la lunette astronomique, je pense que c'est assez bien connu, qui nous a ouvert le monde de l'infiniment grand, du microscope qui nous a ouvert à l'infiniment petit, au cinéma, nous dit-il, et c'était sa grande idée, je pense, qui nous ouvre à l'infiniment moyen, qui était une très belle image, parce que je crois que, bon, je n'ai pas une image de lui là pour illustrer ça, mais comment le cinéma nous permet de circuler à l'intérieur du social, de l'humain, de l'individu, de l'histoire. Et j'ajouterais comment l'ordinateur a permis d'ouvrir sur l'infiniment complexe et comment, justement, cette œuvre ici du japonais Ikeda place l'humain devant l'ensemble des données, des data, des big data, et comment on est, si on peut dire, à une échelle qui nous met en contexte de la complexité de l'information avec laquelle on a maintenant à fonctionner. J'ai repris ici une idée d'un ami français, Olivier Aubert, qui a mis l'accent sur le changement de perspective. La perspective spatiale, on la connaît depuis bien longtemps. Elle a évidemment beaucoup été documentée en histoire de l'art. La perspective temporelle, qui permet de mettre ensemble des récepteurs qui ne sont pas dans le même temps, ni à la même vitesse, mais qui se retrouvent dans un même espace, avec une perspective, avec un temps de fuite. Et ce qui est peut-être le plus important, la perspective numérique, qui, elle, permet une commutation de tous à tous. Et ici, on a son dispositif, le générateur poétique, qui permet, dans un dispositif de peer-to-peer, de mettre ensemble des internautes, des gens qui apportent du contenu, transforment une image et co-construisent une image ensemble. C'est un dispositif, une installation qui existe depuis déjà près de 2 décennies et qui est encore active. Ce qui était nouveau, comme dans le peer-to-peer, c'est que ce n'est pas un ordinateur central ou un serveur qui gère, c'est vraiment les échanges de l'un à un et de un à tous. Quelques remarques déjà un peu sur ces considérations. Le numérique est un langage commun aux sciences, aux technologies et aux arts, ce qui facilite, on s'en doute, les échanges, qui favorise les collaborations intersectorielles. Les médias sont naturellement, si on peut dire, interdisciplinaires, déjà parce que ça exige un langage algorithmique, l'intervention souvent d'informaticiens, d'ingénieurs et d'artistes. D'artistes de divers horizons, que ce soit des artistes de la performance, des artistes de l'image, du son, de l'architecture, etc. Et puis, grâce aux technologies, on réalise que les formes d'art dépassent elles-mêmes un intérêt strictement esthétique, bien que ce ne soit pas du tout, négligé, mais pour poser des questions, des problèmes qui excèdent largement le domaine strict des arts. Et là, je reprends cette très belle phrase de Cheryl qui était citée dans un numéro spécial de la revue Nature en septembre dernier sur l'interdisciplinarité et qui nous dit que les problèmes dans le monde ne sont pas des problèmes disciplinaires. Pardon. ce sont des problèmes qui interpellent nécessairement des regards croisés et des expertises provenant de divers milieux. Alors, je me réfère ici à Nicolescu, dont j'ai dit 2 mots tout à l'heure, et qui essaye de définir et de distinguer multidisciplinarité. En français, on dirait peut-être plutôt pluridisciplinarité, interdisciplinarité et transdisciplinarité. Alors, il nous dit que la multidisciplinarité, c'est le fait que plusieurs disciplines, ensemble, s'intéressent à un même objet. Et l'exemple qu'il donne est très simple. Une toile de Giotto, on a l'histoire de l'art, peut-être l'histoire des matériaux, l'histoire des religions, l'esthétique, la philosophie, etc., qui viennent porter un regard et documenter, et essayer d'interpréter l'œuvre. L'interdisciplinarité est déjà peut-être un peu plus complexe puisqu'elle se décline en 3 degrés d'interdisciplinarité, nous dit-il. Le premier degré, c'est l'application d'une méthode d'une discipline sur une autre discipline. L'exemple qu'il donne, c'est par exemple la physique quantique, dont on utilise des résultats pour l'appliquer à la médecine et faire la médecine nucléaire, physique nucléaire, pour faire de la médecine nucléaire. Alors, on applique une méthode d'un domaine dans un autre. Le deuxième niveau de degré, c'est le degré qu'il appelle épistémologique et qui consiste à transférer une méthode d'une discipline à une autre. Par exemple, le fait que le droit emprunte à la logique, à la discipline logique, et que la logique vienne traverser l'ensemble, si on peut dire, du discours ou de la recherche en droit. Et le troisième niveau, qui est un niveau assez simple, je pense aussi à comprendre parce qu'on est assez familier avec ça, c'est le fait qu'il y a une rencontre et un croisement de 2 disciplines, comme par exemple la biologie et la chimie pour faire la biochimie. C'était d'ailleurs beaucoup le cas dans le domaine des arts médiatiques, où des formes d'art se sont divisées puis se sont croisées avec d'autres disciplines. La transdisciplinarité, et qui nous intéresse plus particulièrement aujourd'hui, enfin qui m'intéresse plus particulièrement aujourd'hui, concerne, comme le préfixe le dit, ce qui est entre les disciplines, à travers les disciplines et au-delà de toute discipline. Évidemment, ça n'exclut pas qu'on puisse avoir recours à la pluridisciplinarité, à l'interdisciplinarité, mais avec la transdisciplinarité, on dépasse, si on peut dire, la pointure, quelle qu'elle soit, d'une discipline, pour essayer de travailler dans des interstices et dans des croisements autres. Il signale qu'il y a 3 piliers de la transdisciplinarité. La logique du tiers inclus, je vous mais donne un exemple très simple qui permet de le saisir. Si je dis par exemple, il y a des végétaux et les non-végétaux, on comprend que si je change de niveau, si je dis par exemple, il y a les fruits et les non-fruits, si je change de niveau pour passer au niveau végétaux, bien, je viens d'inclure le non-fruit, parce qu'il y a des fruits, des légumes, etc., qui rentrent dans la catégorie végétaux. Puis là, il y a végétaux, non-végétaux, puis si je rentre à un niveau plus élevé, le vivant, bien, j'ai les végétaux et les non-végétaux qui se trouvent inclus. Le deuxième pilier, c'est le niveau, comme il le signale, le fait que les niveaux de perception, alors qui souvent dépendent de l'instrumentation, mais l'instrumentation, elle n'est pas que technique, elle est aussi évidemment cognitive. Elle dépend aussi du cadrage avec lequel on regarde. Les niveaux de perception sont corrélés à des niveaux de réalité, et c'est vrai qu'à partir du moment où on peut percevoir un phénomène ou un ordre de phénomènes, prenons les changements climatiques, à partir du moment où on peut les percevoir, on arrive à les penser, c'est-à-dire, et on développe tout un appareil, si on peut dire, autour de la question, que ça devient un niveau de réalité qui était inexistant, on va dire, 30 ans auparavant. Et puis, le troisième pilier, c'est la complexité. La transdisciplinarité, nous dit-il, postule et explore la pluralité complexe et l'unité ouverte. Et la méthodologie transdisciplinaire repose sur une écologie transdisciplinaire qui postule la coévolution de l'être humain et de l'univers. Ça, comme plusieurs l'ont dit, et beaucoup d'autres chercheurs. Les grands défis qu'on y associe, Chris, fais-moi signe quand il me restera 5 minutes, please. OK. Le grand défi que rencontre la transdisciplinarité, c'est évidemment le fait que la complexité a pulvérisé la discipline. Et pour tous ceux qui travaillent en milieu institutionnel, on sait que les disciplines restent encore un cadrage bien ancré et que c'est pas facile de travailler à l'échelle interdisciplinaire, interdépartementale. Je ne veux pas rentrer là-dedans. C'est pas des sujets parmi les plus intéressants, mais c'est néanmoins quelque chose qui est extrêmement prégnant et déterminant. Il y a un processus aussi de babélisation, c'est-à-dire où on peut avoir l'impression qu'on rentre dans un univers trop touffu, trop, comment dire, où on perd nos repères, on perd nos assises théoriques, nos assises disciplinaires, et ça peut devenir un peu lost in translation, disons, où on est un peu perdu. Comme l'a dit une jeune artiste qui écrit québécoise, une diplômée de l'UQAM, les murs ne sont pas tous faits de pierre. Alors, il y a aussi des résistances qui, elles, sont idéologiques, épistémologiques ou même simplement personnelles, si on peut dire, et qui rendent très difficiles les échanges. Ça ouvre la place à des méthodologies inventives, comme j'ai une diapositive qui suit là-dessus, je la laisse pour l'information pour ça. Et les œuvres collectives, les œuvres sont de plus en plus collectives et faites en co-création, un peu plus sur le modèle des arts scientifiques du contributorship plutôt que de l'authorship individuel. Et ça aussi, c'est à la fois un nouveau modèle, mais aussi un défi et qui peut rencontrer un certain nombre de résistances. Et enfin, le passage de l'écosystème à l'infosystème, j'ai une diapo là-dessus. En fait, il y a plusieurs types les méthodologies elles-mêmes ont explosé. Chris a fait référence à la recherche-création tout à l'heure dans ton ouverture, et c'est vrai que la recherche-création, c'est quand même un nouveau paradigme, en tout cas en milieu universitaire, puis dans le milieu artistique aussi, parce que c'est vrai que si les artistes ont toujours fait de la recherche, leur production était évaluée au niveau de la production artistique plutôt que de la recherche qui était en support à la création. Alors que depuis une décennie ou un peu plus, les universités, les facultés d'art se sont ouvertes à la dimension de recherche-création. Les fonds aussi, le fonds FRQSC que j'ai le plaisir de diriger depuis un mois, a un programme de recherche-création depuis 2005 et qui essaye de justement soutenir les démarches des chercheurs. Alors, ça prend diverses formes au niveau de la recherche-création. Mais il y a aussi la recherche-innovation, la recherche-développement, de practice as research, performance as research, la recherche-intervention, etc. Puis, il y a plusieurs méthodes, et là, j'étais vraiment, parce qu'il n'y a pas assez d'espace, il y a énormément de méthodes qui sont interpellées pour faire de la recherche ou pour produire de l'art en conjugaison avec de la recherche dans le milieu de la recherche-création. Je ne les énumère pas, vous les voyez, je crois, à l'écran. Le passage de l'écosystème à l'infosystème pose aussi un certain nombre de défis, notamment parce qu'on rentre dans un univers qui est absolument foisonnant, qui est immatériel, qui est archivé selon des méthodes inhabituelles pour les gens en art. Les gens en art étaient habitués d'exposer des artefacts dans certains contextes. Évidemment, ça a changé, ça a évolué, la mise en scène des œuvres, mais il y avait quand même, comment dire, un environnement physique qui offrait à la fois des contraintes, mais aussi un cadre pour mettre en place les œuvres. On rentre dans un domaine où, dans l'infosystème, si on peut dire, dans un domaine où l'art se fait de plus en plus avec de l'information, devient stocké, devient conservé selon d'autres critères et devient lui-même, si on peut dire, un participant actif à toute l'explosion de l'infosystème. comme le disait David Rugby il y a déjà au moins 15 ans, on a besoin de filtres pour arriver à gérer et à se retrouver dans cet univers pour gérer la prolifération des data. 1 minute? Wow! Ben, j'achève. Alors, j'arrive sur les big data et sur un nouveau programme qui vient qui commence en fait depuis 2013. Et le Québec y participe, le Canada y participe, et c'est un projet qui est né de la plateforme transatlantique en Europe, aux Pays-Bas avec le UK, et qui met à contribution 7 pays européens, l'Allemagne, la France, et des pays, le Canada, le Québec, le fonds, précisément le fonds FRQSC y participe, et les pays d'Amérique latine, le Brésil, le Mexique, enfin, peut-être d'autres pays, il y a 13 pays en tout. Et depuis 2013, ont ouvert un nouveau programme, Digging into Data, et il faut que les équipes de recherche, et là, c'est vraiment une annonce que je fais, que les équipes de recherche, parce qu'il y a très peu de projets, il y a eu 4 projets canadiens financés au cours des 2 premiers concours, mais il devrait y en avoir plus, je pense. Les équipes doivent être transatlantiques et doivent comporter au moins 3 partenaires, donc 3 pays. Et alors, il s'agit de digging into data, d'aller faire des recherches, de mise en valeur, d'essayer d'explorer des bases de données, d'essayer de les mettre, d'y trouver du sens, parce qu'on comprend que souvent ça a été construit pas forcément dans le but d'être récupéré ou pas d'être récupéré dans le format où on va essayer de les récupérer. L'accès n'est pas facile parce que parfois ça a été enregistré sur des médiums auxquels on a difficilement accès maintenant. Enfin, il y a toute une série là d'enjeux qui sont reliés, je les ai énumérés là. Il y a même des enjeux éthiques, on le comprend, parce que quand ces données-là ont été enregistrées, les gens n'étaient pas nécessairement au courant qu'un jour ça allait être réutilisé dans un tout autre domaine, etc. Alors, c'est ouvert, il y a de la documentation sur le site Digging into Data. En conclusion, les arts médiatiques sont vraiment la croisée d'immenses enjeux, comme beaucoup de formes d'art, mais je dirais qu'ils sont au cœur d'une série d'enjeux de société et de civilisation. D'abord par la prolifération même des formes d'art qui va dans une multitude de directions, qui échappent maintenant au recensement. Je crois que c'est impossible de pouvoir refaire un dictionnaire des arts médiatiques tellement tellement il est éclaté. Les arts médiatiques ont une capacité d'intégration de toutes les données du monde. Je veux dire que ce soit des données numériques, que ce soit des données sonores, des données visuelles, des données factuelles, des événementielles, etc. Je veux dire, c'est sans limite. Les arts médiatiques ont une facilité de modifier et d'adapter les cadrages. C'est probablement une de leurs plus grandes qualités, de pouvoir nous orienter et déplacer le point de vue, déplacer la perspective. C'est une scène privilégiée d'expérimentation de la de l'inter et de la transdisciplinarité. Maintenant, on dirait de la transsectorialité, puisque ce n'est pas seulement des disciplines, mais des secteurs qui sont en jeu. C'est un terrain d'essai de méthodologies nouvelles et c'est un lieu de création d'autres formes de vie. Voilà. Peut-être une petite annonce. Gisèle en a parlé tout à l'heure, mais là, je vous donne les références exactes du lieu où ça va se dérouler, du lancement donc de la revue N-Media, Média N, qui sera lancée, qui regroupe beaucoup de chercheurs d'Hexagramme et quelques invités internationaux. Voilà, merci.
Thank you very much, Louise. Next, we have Georgina Bourne from the University of Oxford, and I think we'll just go straight in because we're running a little behind. So.
try to make it, but if... Oh, okay. Okay, well, thank you so much to Gisèle and Chris and Oliver. It's great to be here. I'm going to give this paper. I speak as an anthropologist. Okay. I speak as an anthropologist who works on contemporary art, music, and media. Current project actually is not on this, but on digital musics. And my work crosses the social sciences and humanities and tends to take in both institutions and institutional forms and the art practices and works and events that derive from those conditions. I want to apologize for my rather busy and dull slides, because we've had some beautiful slides so far, but there you go. Also to point out that, you know, I represent, thank you, a kind of older model of anthropological ethnography in what I do, and I mention that because Chris has a recent book out, Alien Agency, which we could debate, you know, for a long time, which is a different take on ethnographic work in this area. And I'm going to talk about this field called art science, which of course is itself a problematic term. We've already had Louise talking about the problem of categories and naming. It's a fuzzy and emergent and evolving category, perhaps coined primarily by the funding agencies, the policymakers, the university programs, but there you go. This is an artwork I'm going to come to towards the end, called Pigeon Blog by Beatrice da Costa, and that's the end of my journey. And a few publications of my own. There's a book called Interdisciplinarity, Reconfigurations of the Social and Natural Sciences, which has a chapter on the work I'm going to present to you today. But some other papers, one that's getting quite a lot of hits called Logics of Interdisciplinarity, and this paper, Art Science, From Public Understanding to Public Experiment, which I'll talk about today. So I want to begin with this notion of problematization, which I take from Foucault through the anthropologist Paul Rabineau, and there are some quotes up there, but due to time I won't pull them out, except to pull out from Foucault this idea of a moment at which something enters into the play of true and false and gets constituted as an object of thought. And we want to, in our research, we wanted to take the moment of the late 90s, early 2000s, when the discourse of interdisciplinarity and trans becomes so prominent, and see it as a moment of problematization. And I won't go into this because Michael has beautifully already been there, but the publication first of the 1994 book by Nowotny, Peter Scott and Michael Gibbons, and then Rethinking Science in 2001 gave us a beautiful moment and a kind of paradigm against which to do our work. And though it's a very rich set of ideas in that work from Nowotny and others, I myself am very interested in Helga Nowotny. She's a marvelous animateur of research funding and policy in Europe. She's been responsible for creating a huge research body that I don't know how many of you have heard about yet in North America, Canada, and Quebec, but it's called the European Research Council. It was the brainchild of Helga Nowotny. It's an astonishing response-led large program of huge grants. I'm lucky to be the recipient of one, so conflict of interest. And, but she's an astonishing figure. Nonetheless, and by the way, the ERC is funding a lot of interesting transdisciplinary research, also practice-based research in the arts and in music and so on. However, in our work, we took off from a feeling of dissatisfaction about the intellectual account of interdisciplinarity given in this work, which tends to describe its very German social theory in terms of these sort of grand epochal shifts from mode one to mode two knowledge production. And we thought this was kind of problematic. Reified notion of science, reified notion of society, and they're both sort of moving in parallel. Instead, we felt that there was very little empirical research so far on what people are actually doing when they do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, and that's what we set out to do. We wanted to make this, to address this as a heterogeneous space, to look at the very path-dependent genealogies in distinctive fields, the different kinds of practice, the different motivations going on. And we chose, in the mid-2000s when we did this work, 4 interdisciplinary fields. We wanted to look at fields that cross between the natural sciences or engineering on the one hand, and the arts, humanities, and social sciences on the other. And we looked at 4 fields. You'll see that ethnography in the IT industry, anthropology's migration into Xerox PARC, Intel, Microsoft, Nokia, and other places was one of our studies. We looked at interdisciplinary environmental and climate change research, and we looked at the way that a new field called ELSI, Ethical, Legal, and Sociological Implications of Biotechnology Research, has grown up in the recent last 15 years, and we took also a study on that. But the one I want to talk to you about, which I did my work on, is art science, broadly. Out of those, first I'm going to present some general findings from our work across these 4 fields. And in this way, we identified what we call 3 modes of interdisciplinarity. We've already had some categorizations of these things, but I'm going to add to this. Louise already offered us some. I'm going to distinguish between what we would call the integrative or synthesis mode. We identified this with a Harvard study by Gardner and Mansilla. A great deal of literature out there, but we see this as a fairly uninteresting and problematic, certainly as a normative model. We call it an additive model, perhaps close to multidisciplinarity. And the way that this is often written about is as a synthesis of what are sometimes deemed antecedent disciplines that sort of come together, engage, but very little changes in these disciplines. We distinguish that from a second mode we call the subordination service mode, and this is a tremendously common experience. Many of you may have had it. That is the existence of a hierarchical division of labor, or we might call them master-servant relations between disciplines that come together supposedly to engage or collaborate. One or more disciplines is often brought in to kind of serve or supplement a lack in the master disciplines. Here's an example. It's often how the social sciences are treated by the sciences, the natural and engineering sciences. So we have a rather humorous, the first example there from Bristol University's Environmental Research Centre, which lists 11 disciplines that contribute to its research. But just one of these 11 disciplines is called sustainability science, and wrapped inside that are all the social sciences listed. Environmental economics, environmental law, politics, development studies, anthropology, geography, and so on and so on and so forth. So it's a beautiful setup, which in its very description kind of creates this extraordinary kind of hierarchical arrangement. And we wanted to, the problem with the subordination service mode is that the possibility, given this kind of hierarchical lock-in, of any kind of interesting epistemological change seems to us to be rather inhibited, becomes problematic. Nothing is very easy to change when things are locked in that way. And the third mode that we wanted to distinguish contrasts with both of those. We call it the agonistic-antagonistic mode. And here I tip my hat to Chantal Mouffe, who's with transposing, if you like, into the politics of knowledge at this point. And what we decided by looking at our fields is that this agonistic-antagonistic mode stems from criticism of or opposition to the limits or impasses of established disciplines, academic or expert knowledges. So what's going on is a desire to transcend the given epistemological and ontological premises of the so-called antecedent disciplines. And the key point, of course, is that the new interdiscipline is irreducible to those antecedent disciplines and could not possibly be evaluated in additive terms. And I'm going to come back at the end to the problem of evaluation, which came up quite strongly yesterday in the Emerging Researchers Conference, so questions of evaluation. Now, this third mode, I would say, is quite close to transdisciplinarity as we often understand it. But in addition to those three modes, we identified three logics of interdisciplinarity by which we mean to point out, in this particular historical moment, prevalent motivations or rationales or orientations. And again, we distinguish three. The first we call the logic of accountability, and I'll talk about that briefly in a minute in relation to art science. Let's say the public understanding of science paradigm is a perfect exemplar of an accountability kind of interdisciplinarity. Second, we call the logic of innovation, and here very much resonates with Michael's paper. We point to those modes of interdisciplinarity that are primarily oriented to affecting industrial or technological innovation with the goal of fueling economic growth, technological change, the creative or knowledge economy, those rubrics. And again, we want to contrast that with a third logic, which we call the logic of ontology, and those of you who know the work of Lorraine Daston or Bruno Latour, Anne-Marie Moll, we're tipping our hat again to these important writers in the history of science and science technology studies. And we see this logic as having a privileged relation to our third mode, the agonistic-antagonistic mode, and indeed to transdisciplinarity. What we point to here is when certain kinds of interdisciplinarity entail an ontological and epistemological shift towards what we might call a relational conception of the subject-object and often of the imminently social nature of the object of research, whether that object is nature, the environment, art, science, technology, whatever. Give you an example from our work on ethnography in the IT industry. As we put it, ethnography can be employed to achieve a transformation of the ontological imagination of the firm, Xerox, Intel, Microsoft, towards a conception of the intentional industrial object as what we might, in this company, call a socio-cultural technical assemblage. And that's the work that I think people like Genevieve Bell and her cadres are achieving, as many of you will know, in the IT industry. Our point was not that these are completely distinct. I mean, these three logics we often find entangled to different degrees and in different ways in different interdisciplinary fields. So now I want to zoom in on art science. We took two sites in the UK and in the US, and I'm mostly going to talk about the American work, and I'll come to that in a short while. But for now, very briefly, this weird chart here, which you can probably barely read, contrasts some of the key findings we found in our two sites. I'm going to try to summarize it very briefly, because what's so interesting is how the very institutional form, the nature of the policy and the funding going into constituting this field seem to have such dramatic effects. In the UK, as I'll talk about in a second, we have primarily in the last 20 years a commissioning model, short-term collaborative projects and artists going in to work with a scientist in a university, often very short-term, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, under 18 months, unsustained, less funding, rather fragmentary. This goes along with the prominence of a logic of accountability and of innovation. You'll see why in a minute, and a rather weak development, at least publicly, in the funding and policy realm of our logic of ontology. There's a continuing division of labor. Often artists are working, as it were, in a service subordination mode to science, big S, or particular scientists, or to celebrate or publicize a particular program of research. Evaluation seems to be less critical. Why? Purely because these are short-term, low-funded projects. And what's interesting, we found, less developed genealogies. I'll come to that shortly as well. In contrast, the American scene that we looked at, and please let me qualify, this was what I looked at. There may well be many examples of what I've just talked about happening in the States and in Canada and in Quebec as well. But the program I looked at, which was based at Irvine, the University of California at Irvine, was a situation in which salaried tenured, or would-be tenured faculty would work together to create art science projects in that situation within the university. And it's not alone, of course. As we know, a great deal of this kind of work is now going on increasingly in centers and initiatives and simply between faculty within the university system, also in Australia and elsewhere. We found the logic of innovation very pronounced. For example, at Irvine, there's this whole huge corporate agenda linked to a notion of the framework called CalIT squared. And Irvine has a very, very pronounced corporate outreach kind of research agenda. But we also found that the logic of ontology is very prominent, and I'm going to be telling you in what way. We found that the division of labor gets muddy, gets more fluid, that different kinds of interdisciplinarity become possible in these more sustained and in some ways secure situations. I'll talk about that. But such sustained funding poses acute problems of evaluation. Tenure, key moment at which interdisciplinarians hit the problem of how does one evaluate, how does one valorize the kind of work going on. And finally, very pronounced and ramifying genealogies in the program we were looking at, which I'll shortly tell you. So I don't need to tell this audience, but of course the kind of the fact that this field takes its bearings in part from conceptual and post-conceptual art was something we were very interested in, and in particular the degree to which that legacy could or could not be made manifest in the research going on. So here is the genealogy of art science from the UK, according to my interviews and research with a number of artists. Interesting that this was the artist's point of view, not that of the funding bodies, and you'll see that it's a sort of fairly classic conceptual art, post-conceptual art, going into media arts, bio-art, and so on and so forth. This is the genealogy of art science. I'm being a little bit cheeky here to Michael because I took this from his Rockefeller report in 1999 that he's told us about, which is an amazing report. But I would say that what we see here on the right of my screen is one particular genealogy through the studio laboratory that he told us about. And we know why, you know, that was of interest to his audience, which was the Rockefeller Foundation. Here, on the other hand, is the genealogy of art science as I encountered it at Irvine in this program that I'm going to tell you about. It's wide, it's ramifying, and you'll hear more about this shortly. Very briefly, to tell you about the genealogy of art science in the UK, I'm going to identify three eras, three paradigms of the funding and the policy going into supporting art science. It arrives in 1985 with the Royal Society, the leading expert society in Britain, beginning its discourse on the public understanding of science and science communication. And immediately there are ideas of, you know, scientists learning to communicate better with the public, a kind of accountability model. From the mid-1990s, this evolves and mutates into a public engagement, a participation paradigm, responding to wider changes in the political culture. The Wellcome Trust, a huge medical and science funding body in the UK, begins to put money into art science at this point. And by the 2000s, the knowledge economy paradigm comes on board, the 2000 Lisbon Agenda, the EU adopts a knowledge economy funding paradigm, and so on. And the UK follows suit. The Council of Science and Technology begins to write about the arts and humanities in relation to science and technology, begins to put money in, and a whole host of bodies, the Arts Council, Nesta, the Arts and Humanities Research Board, the Gulbenkian, everybody starts to put bits of money in, little bits of money. And what's interesting at this point is a tension begins to emerge, and certainly the Arts Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Board reject the more instrumental public understanding of science, kind of science communication model, and try to develop frameworks within which artists can work in a more equal and collaborative ways rather than in that service model. But in practice, the limitations are that finally many people, from funding administrators to artists to scientists, tended to feel that there was little sense of the potential for mutual transformation. I'm talking about, this is almost 10 years ago now, and for the logic of ontology or real transdisciplinarity to evolve. And I would accept here very small, interesting, independent bodies. I'm very glad we're going to hear about that shortly from Gisèle in Quebec. But for example, a very interesting body called the Arts Catalyst in Britain that does an enormous amount of important work in this area. So in the last bit, I want to tell you a bit about the research at Irvine. And some of you will know that Irvine was one of those University of California campuses founded as a model of the interdisciplinary university in the 60s. That's a kind of little map of ACE is the ego in this little kinship map. Lots of lines of connection, tons of centers for this, that, and the other, all of them deemed to be interdisciplinary. And ACE is the program I'm going to tell you about. So within Irvine, there had grown, under the aegis and the guidance of Simon Penny, my colleague sitting here today, a master's program called Arts, Computation and Engineering, ACE. And it was an experiment, pedagogical experiment, in forming interdisciplinary subjects. It involved 3 schools coming together, the arts, information and computer science and engineering schools, and the biosciences were pending. And I'm going to introduce a concept of interdisciplinarity in one person. The idea was that these students would be invited to, they would be affiliated with 2 of the 3 schools, and they would be invited to themselves internalize and become adept in the kind of transdisciplinary landscape made possible, that crossing these 3 fields, feeder fields. And within that, I'm going to talk in particular about the work of one ACE faculty member, the art scientist Beatrice da Costa, who was also a public artist and activist, and I've also listed up there a number of the other faculty, including Simon, who were working there at the time. I want to tell you something about the substance of the pedagogy, the program at this time. I won't be able to do this at length because of time, but you can see, I hope, in this slide, I'm taking this from the handbooks of key papers and teaching materials that students were handed, and I sat in on seminars and watched the teaching, and you can see this incredible attempt, Simon's, in fact, a vision here, of taking these students through an extraordinary range of fields, from artificial life to computational modeling of virtual creatures, to the aesthetics of behavior, to expressive AI, avatars with emotion, various kind of movements out of the critique of AI and its limits, phenomenological and other ways out. Into this mix was added partly through the work of Andrew Pickering, the historian of science, the work of the early British cyberneticists, Beer and Pask, and their extraordinary work, through autopoiesis, Maturana and Varela, and other interesting fields, robotics, the problem of simulating autonomy, sentience, and environmental responsiveness in artificial organisms. And finally, and most importantly, a third trajectory cutting through and destabilizing this whole huge set of universes I've alluded to. And this was feminist and critical cultural studies of science and technology, the work of Fox Keller, Haraway, Emily Martin, Sarah Kemba, and others, throwing into relief the ideological underpinnings of the alliance between the new biology and A-life, and charting the collusive materialization and re-engineering of the new sciences in the guise of post-human A-life technological systems. So once again, that's what this genealogy is supposed to be showing you. You can see also there in the dark blue column, critical and feminist STS. So this is the broad vision that the ACE program was teaching, and it was a vision of art science that I found particularly compelling and interesting. Within the seminar itself, if I had time, I would love to take you through this. I'm using Peter Gallison's idea of trading zone behavior, because what you could see is the students being trained to think about interlanguages, to develop kind of points of connection across and between more technical, more epistemological, more concrete, practical questions, and indeed political and critical questions. So I'm going to just quote a very brief moment. So at one point, the question comes up, how can you establish the search space when the search function moves from an AI paradigm to an embodied, situated robotics context? How can you establish the search space as discrete and limited when a mobile agent is operating in unlimited physical space? How can you model an encounter with a human hand? How can the continuous variables of the analog world be translated into digital values? Could it be done with sensors? Simon reminds the students that all technologies encode particular theories of perception and of the world, noting that one response to these problems was the rise of work on situated cognition. A student offers as an alternative the brute force solution. He says, what if we had infinite computing power and all possible representations of a hand, which leads to discussion of the limits to sheer computational power and the potential discrepancies between even massively powered digital representations and the subtleties of the analog world, which can exceed such representations, at which point I can join in and I illustrate the same issue from computer music because it's prevalent there. And thence we move to feminist commentaries on the gendering of infinite power argumentation. Such linguistic and register shifting was striking in this attempt at forming interdisciplinary subjects, and it seemed to me both intellectually effective and quite moving. So I've already gone over, I would have told you about Beatrice's wonderful project, Pigeon Blog. I think what I want to just tell you very briefly in a couple of minutes is that this, to me, was a really exemplary piece of interdisciplinary logic of ontology or transdisciplinary work. What happened was that she worked with an Irvine-based air pollution scientist called Rufus Edwards over several years, learning quite deeply about the science of air pollution at the time. And it was actually Beatrice, in dialogue with Rufus, who came up with an incredibly interesting proposal. And it was for a new kind of sensor that could be carried by pigeons across the most polluted areas of Los Angeles, which tend not to be monitored by the fixed air pollution monitoring centers that mainly are in the wealthy areas of LA. So what the air pollution monitoring system did was never get to the poorer areas of LA where most of the problems lie and a great deal of pollution-related disease. So Beatrice developed this amazing these sensors to be carried by pigeons, which could monitor diffusion in mobile ways over time across these areas, the diffusion of pollutions and pollutants across the areas of LA that the other monitoring stations didn't touch. And the data was gathered and put on a website next to analysis and educational material. And she developed a participatory practice also with those groups and populations most affected by this air pollution disease. So we could say that Pigeon Blog combined artistic and social and political value. But of course, it can't really be understood in those additive terms. And what Beatrice and ourselves decided was this project enacts a logic of ontology. Rather than presenting ready-made science to the public, Pigeon Blog generates a new scientific practice, reconfiguring air quality not as a property of air, but as a relation between pollution and those most affected by it. This is a relational knowledge of air pollution developed through reflexive engagements between participants who are both the subjects and objects of knowledge who engage in its co-production, so that the knowledge produced also changes to take account for the first time of race and class, inequality and injustice. So if I had time, I'd tell you about Pigeon Blog as not so much public understanding, but what we might call a public experiment. But I want to end with the issue of evaluation. What was astonishing in Irvine was that from the moment I arrived, everybody across the university knew of ACE, the program, knew about Beatrice's work, and there was widespread admiration. But Irvine, as a university, found ACE's value very hard to calibrate. And this was signaled by inadequate funds, lack of staffing, lack of progress in the creation of a PhD program, temporary porta gap in buildings, and so on and so forth. So overall, there was a kind of chronic failure to solve the problem of interdisciplinary mechanisms of evaluation for the program and for promotion and tenure. Beatrice's case is a perfect example. When she went for promotion, initially they put together some arts people and some straight engineers. And you can imagine what happened. I mean, it was not the tenure committee that would understand the work she was doing. To end with a bit of sadness, for me certainly, and I'm sure for Simon, maybe relief too, this situation resolved when in 2009 the ACE program was closed. And of extreme sadness for me and for us all is that Beatrice, an extraordinarily talented art scientist, died in 2012 of a long-standing battle with cancer. Her work lauded by Donna Haraway and many others. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina. And we conclude with Gisèle Trudel from UQAM and Cheryl Sim from DHC-Art in terms of the genealogies of some of these questions in this milieu of Quebec.
Mais pour commencer, peut-être on va juste vous expliquer qu'on va essayer de faire un genre de conversation. On va le faire in English et en français. Alors, la suggestion de Gisèle, c'est que vous portez les écouteurs à moitié, like a DJ, something like that. Donc, notre panel s'appelle Weaving Strands, Research Creation Practices in Universities, Cultural Institutions, and Artist-Run Centers in Montreal. We're going to talk about how the threads of research creation practices and how artist-run culture has created the conditions of possibility for these to weave through universities and cultural institutions through possibilities created by artist-run culture.
Yes. So, as this conversation, ce qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va commencer avec quelques définitions. Donc, la recherche-création a été nommée dans plusieurs organismes de subvention. Alors d'abord, le Conseil des arts du Canada dit que c'est un volet qui s'adresse aux artistes dont la pratique conjugue simultanément expérimentation, exploration et recherche aux étapes de production. Le Conseil des arts et des lettres, le volet développement des arts numériques, est essentiellement pareil au programme du Conseil des arts du Canada, mais le volet relève est différent parce qu'il parle de projets de recherche, de création et d'exploration dans ce cas-ci, et le projet artistique doit établir un lien de collaboration avec, ou de partenariat avec la collectivité. Donc, on se posait la question, comment ça se fait que la relève doit avoir une connexion avec la communauté, puis pourquoi pas les artistes établis? C'est intéressant. L'autre chose qu'il dit, c'est le projet met en relation des créateurs de pratiques artistiques différentes, qui n'est pas nommé non plus pour les artistes établis. Ensuite, on a le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, donc le CRSH ou le CHERC. Donc, ce qui est nommé, c'est l'approche de recherche combine des pratiques de création de recherche universitaire, favorise la production de connaissances et innovation face à l'expression artistique, à l'analyse scientifique et à l'expérimentation. Donc, on voit un mot qui revient souvent, c'est expérimentation. Le processus de création fait partie intégrante de l'activité de recherche. Et je pense que ça, c'est vraiment une manière clé de parler de la recherche-création qui rejoint la pensée de plusieurs auteurs dont on va parler aussi. Le FRQSC, donc l'organisme de subvention provincial, parle de la recherche-création qui doit contribuer à un développement disciplinaire. Alors ici, c'est intéressant encore une fois, donc on revient à la discipline. par un renouvellement des connaissances ou des savoir-faire. Et puis, je pense que, évidemment, il y a plusieurs autres points dans chacune de ces définitions-là, mais le point important que je trouve que le FRQSC mentionne, c'est la formation des étudiants. Donc, il n'y a pas souvent d'autres qui le mentionnent, et je crois que ça montre encore une fois une particularité de la recherche à l'université. Pierre Gosselin et Éric Lecoguiec, dans leur livre de 2006, qu'ils ont pris comme, où ils sont les éditeurs, La recherche-création pour une compréhension de la recherche en pratique artistique, posent les questions suivantes. Comment notre rapport à ce type particulier de recherche évolue-t-il dans les facultés d'art et plus largement dans les universités? Et quels sont les modes méthodologiques utiles pour la poursuite de ces recherches? Alors, donc, je pense que les discussions d'aujourd'hui amènent une certaine lumière. Monique Bruno et André Villeneuve, aussi directeurs d'un livre, un recueil de textes qui s'appelle « Traité de recherche-création en art », mentionnent qu'il s'agit de méthodologies hybrides et toujours ouvertes à des épistémologies existantes. Alors donc, on parle de connexion et de fusion de plusieurs choses. Par ailleurs, il y a le livre de Brian Massoumi et Aaron Manning, j'allais dire Aaron Massoumi, c'est un peu bizarre, Thought in the Act, 2014. So in their critique of neoliberal economies, they say the category of research creation was implemented in the larger category of Canadian institutional settings without a strong concept of how creative practice and theoretical research interpenetrate. So I agree with what they're saying, but at the same time, I think they're not acknowledging a very specific Canadian context, which is artist-run culture, which has produced theoretical research for several decades. They also say, you know, why don't we take this hyphenation seriously? It's as an interpenetration of processes rather than a communication of products. So they're definitely questioning the whole deliverables aspect, stakeholders, etc. And they say to be truly creative, there should not be a named outcome from the beginning. So that's quite interesting in terms of experiment. And a final definition, which is Kim Sawchuk and Owen Chapman, who's present today, research creation, their article, Research Creation, Intervention, Analysis, and Family Resemblances. So they see research creation as an emergent category within the social sciences and humanities that speaks to contemporary media experiences and different modes of knowing. And they bring a set of 4 modes that they develop on in their papers. So research for creation, research from creation, creative presentations of research, and finally creation as research, which is one of the most complex ones because it enfolds many of the previous categories.
Alors déjà, nous pouvons constater qu'il y a une vraie hétérogénéité parmi les définitions de recherche-création et surtout quand il s'agit des institutions et les théoréticiens, les écrivains. Alors avec ça, on va peut-être parler un peu de la situation des artistes pendant les années 70. What was the situation of artists in the 1970s, particularly in the context of Montreal?
Yes, well, I mean, what was happening pour les artistes, c'est qu'en réalité, il y avait très peu de possibilités de présenter les œuvres, le travail. En fait, les années 70, les artistes étaient en réaction aux institutions culturelles qui ne montraient pas l'art contemporain. Ils montraient les œuvres de l'histoire de l'art. Et alors, les artistes ont décidé de créer leur propre structure de diffusion et de présentation et de créer du travail lui-même. Ce qu'il faut dire, c'est que il y a des contextes, on va tirer ça à grands traits quand même, mais les années 60 et 70 ont contribué à cette prise de parole et prise de position des artistes. Donc, on avait quand même un esprit libertaire de contre-culture dans cette période. Il y avait la crise pétrolière qui a fait en sorte que le Québec a changé son mode de dépendance envers le pétrole. Il a voulu développer les grands barrages hydroélectriques, bien sûr, avec beaucoup de problèmes auprès des communautés autochtones. Et alors, ça a ouvert toute une nouvelle discussion sur les questions autochtones au Québec. Il y a eu la crise d'octobre de 1970 avec le FLQ, le Front de libération du Québec, qui voulait l'indépendance totale du Québec. Il y a l'arrivée au pouvoir de René Lévesque en 1976. Et tout ça pointe à des activités qui ont marqué l'imaginaire des Québécois, mais je voudrais aussi retourner un peu en arrière parce que jusqu'à avant la Révolution tranquille, puis c'est des choses que je dis pour le peuple québécois ou les peuples québécois qui sont ici, vous ne savez peut-être pas ces choses-là. Alors, avant la Révolution tranquille, l'éducation était sous l'autorité de l'Église catholique. Et après la Deuxième Grande Guerre, c'était le conservatisme des politiciens et des positions religieuses de l'Église qui ont empêché la modernisation du système d'éducation canadien-français. Je dis canadien-français parce qu'on ne parlait pas encore de québécois à ce moment-là. Et malgré le règne du clergé, le Québec s'est ouvert à beaucoup de tendances internationales. Les Québécois, certains groupes de Québécois ont pu voyager. Il y a eu la signature de 2 manifestes importants en 1948. Alors, Prisme Dieu et aussi Refus global, qui était une critique virulente de toutes les valeurs traditionnelles et une bouffée d'air dans un climat extrêmement oppressant.
I'm just going to talk also about the 1970s and the arrival of multiculturalism policies in Canada, which are related to a discussion on artistic output later on in the 90s. But basically, despite its utopian discourse brought in by the Trudeau government to placate Aboriginal land claims, Quebec separation, and the needs of immigrants for recognition of their contribution to Canadian society, the policy actually worked to articulate differences between a dominant Anglo-Saxon culture and the other. So with all of this in mind, what we've seen is that artists became politicized. They wanted to address their own issues, and they became empowered towards self-determination, ultimately wanting connection with larger social context and to collaborate and share and create meaning with others. Yeah. Donc, maintenant, on va parler de l'émergence de la culture artistique autogérée et la présence des artistes de plus en plus dans les institutions universitaires.
Oui. Donc, j'enchaîne avec les années 70, avec 3 centres qui ont été créés à Montréal. Donc, as Clive Robertson has said, a militant artist-run person for several years, if there wasn't a gallery, we made one. If there was no one publishing the text, we created a publishing house to publish the text. So it's a very strong method of just doing things, actually. And so, la galerie véhiculaire a ouvert ses portes en 1972 au centre-ville de Montréal avec un premier espace d'exposition alternatif qu'on appelait jadis Galerie parallèle. C'était un centre à but non lucratif, et ça c'est très important de le souligner parce que toute la culture des centres artistes était à l'extérieur du marché de l'art et c'était géré par et pour des artistes. On y retrouvait un espace d'exposition, un lieu d'expérimentation, des formations, des groupes d'études, des conférences, un centre de documentation. Sounds like a university. En janvier 1974, le centre acquiert un premier portapack, Sony portapack, pour documenter les activités et aussi faire de la création artistique. En 1975, le département vidéo devient vidéo-véhicule. En fait, c'est René Blouin. Je pourrais nommer les noms de plusieurs personnes dans la communauté montréalaise et reconnaître un peu leur trajectoire. Donc, René Blouin qui a créé avec les autres un centre d'accès en production, post-production vidéo. Et en 1981, ça devient Prime, qui existe encore à ce jour. Par ailleurs, il y a le vidéographe, qui est le premier centre d'artistes œuvrant en production vidéographique créé en 1971. Donc, on est à la suite de la crise d'octobre. Il y a beaucoup de réalisateurs et réalisatrices qui sont vraiment en contact avec toutes les questions sociales, tout ce qui émerge de ça. Et la vidéo apparaît encore une fois comme un outil d'intervention et de richesse pour réfléchir sur les questions actuelles pendant qu'elles sont en train de produire. Et ce groupe-là a vu que, par exemple, le budget annuel qui serait attribué à un vidéographe, c'était le coût que ça coûtait pour produire un seul court-métrage. Alors, on comprend qu'il y a des disparités entre les budgets et comment est-ce que ça... Pour 200 000 $, vidéographe a commencé, mais c'était le coût d'un seul court-métrage. Alors, aujourd'hui, vidéographe a encore un réseau de diffusion, de distribution de plus de 1500 titres. Un autre groupe très important est le groupe Intervention vidéo, fondé à Montréal en 1975 par des réalisateurs et réalisatrices indépendants engagés dans le changement social, encore une fois. Et c'est les femmes en particulier qui se sont appropriées les équipements pour faire valoir leur histoire, leur identité et leurs revendications. En 2015, Gilles aura 40 ans. Donc, on ne parle plus de jeunesse, on parle d'âge adulte qui s'en va vers autre chose. mais poursuit toujours son mandat féministe de centre de formation et de distribution de vidéos faites par les femmes.
Oui, les centres d'artistes ont été aussi clés pour le développement des audiences et ils peuvent avoir une multiplicité de mandats et de structures. Alors, ils peuvent répondre aux besoins et désirs d'une variété de communautés dans le milieu artistique. Donc, ça, c'est une autre caractéristique très clé des centres d'artistes au DG. Oui?
Oui, on a mis ici, on peut retracer, c'est un rapport qui a été publié en 2012, qui a été commandé par le Conseil des arts du Canada pour comprendre l'écosystème des centres d'artistes, son émergence, son évolution au Canada. Et on retrace 4 grands points, donc l'autodétermination et l'expérimentation artistique, donc on voit ce mot qui revient, la collaboration, le réseautage, un ancrage dans les grands mouvements sociaux, alors je pense que ça c'est une clé particulièrement importante pour le Québec, et ensuite la tendance récente à recourir à une capacité professionnelle accrue. On pourrait parler de ça, je pense, plus tard, parce que c'est une composante importante et c'est lié à l'université.
Peut-être tu veux enchaîner avec l'université alors?
Oui,
OK.
oui.
C'est bon.
Donc, je vais retourner un peu en arrière parce que c'est pas parce que je suis professeure à l'UQAM que je fais la promotion de l'UQAM, mais j'ai trouvé quand même des sources extrêmement importantes parce que j'ai la chance de pouvoir enseigner là, mais c'est aussi en fonction de toute l'historique des centres d'artistes. Alors, donc, j'ai mentionné tout à l'heure la pensée nouvelle qui attisait le désir de changement au Québec de 1957 à 61, et puis je remercie la présentation de Chantal Provost hier qui a placé quelques items par rapport à ça. Il y avait l'École des beaux-arts de Montréal qui était marquée par les changements au sein de l'art et d'une prise de conscience collective du rôle social de l'artiste. En 1960, et c'est une statistique qui est extrêmement difficile à prendre, seulement 3% des jeunes Canadiens français accédaient à l'université. 1960, ça fait juste 50 ans. La commission Parents représente la modernisation complète du système d'éducation québécois et ainsi le ministère de l'Éducation a été créé en 1964, les cégeps en 67 et l'Université du Québec en 68, ce qui est un réseau sur tout le territoire québécois. L'École des beaux-arts sera l'une des 5 écoles qui fusionneront pour devenir l'UQAM à sa fondation en 69. Et le pavillon Judith Jasmin, que l'on voit en construction ou en déconstruction, abrité la première faculté des arts francophones en Amérique du Nord, conserve une partie de l'église Saint-Jacques comme victoire de la sécularisation de l'éducation. Et l'UQAM trouve sa genèse dans ces mouvements sociaux, politiques et culturels portés par la Révolution tranquille. Mentionnons aussi, avec toute cette évolution dans le temps, le programme de doctorat en études des pratiques des arts qui est instauré depuis 1997. En 1998, le rapport intitulé « Recherche, création et formation à l'université, une articulation à promouvoir entre tous les cycles » est publié par le Conseil supérieur de l'éducation à l'intention de la ministre de l'Éducation et indique « Les activités de mise en rapport, théorie pratique, dans un processus de conceptualisation en lien avec l'objet créé, permettent aux jeunes artistes de développer un cadre théorique novateur en lien avec sa pratique artistique. » Les recherches-créations commençaient à prendre forme.
So let's jump to the 90s now, because the 90s was actually a really crucial and fertile time for artist-run culture. Gisèle and I met at an artist-run center called Obero, where I was exhibition coordinator, and you were coordinating the media lab,
Yep.
which was at the time called Technobero. Do you want to talk a little bit about technology? We're getting close, so I want to talk a little bit about race and representation.
Yep.
Okay.
Ce qui s'est passé dans les années 90, il y a eu un grand renouveau, dont on peut dire quasiment 25 années plus tard que pour les centres d'artistes. Il y a eu beaucoup de centres qui ont été créés, encore une fois avec une série de crises dans les années 90. Par rapport à la crise d'Oka, le référendum, on a les politiques identitaires dont Cheryl va parler. Mais ce que je voudrais dire aussi, c'est qu'il y a puis je pense que ça a le rapport avec ce que l'on a dit tout à l'heure avec Michael, c'est qu'il y a des conditions économiques liées à ces changements. Et Gordon Thiessen, qui était alors le gouverneur général de la Banque de Canada en 2001, a expliqué que c'était je vais juste passer à la prochaine. l'avancement technologique était tributaire des retards et de l'inflation des années 70, parce que l'inflation avait presque quadruplé en 1990. Alors, l'avancement technologique et la mondialisation ont exercé une transformation de l'économie durant cette période. Et au même moment, le gouvernement du Canada a décidé de créer la Fondation canadienne de l'innovation, dont le but était d'accroître la capacité du pays à mener des projets de recherche et de développement technologique dans l'économie du savoir. Et alors, en 2002, Hexagram a soumis un projet pour cette plus grande contribution de financement à la recherche de l'histoire du Canada. Vous l'aurez seulement deviné, c'est deux femmes, deux artistes-chercheurs, Barbara Lane et Lynn Hughes, membres fondatrices d'Hexagram, qui ont soumis cette demande qui a été acceptée.
Yeah, and the 90s were also a time of great activism by artists of color and Aboriginal Inuit artists around identity politics. And not necessarily without major consternation, some ARCs made space for discussions on race and representation, pointing to the uneven power dynamics existing at a variety of levels in both major institutions and artist-run centers and collectives. I'm going to talk about programming initiatives that were actually a result of a lot of this lobbying and awareness around the lack of or underrepresentation of artists of color and Aboriginal programming in artist-run centers, but also in larger institutions. And I'm going to touch just about two significant research creation projects that were based in technology and fostered by artist-run culture, these both happening at Oboro. So first, there's the project series called Moments, initiated by Janet Lum, who was director of what was then called the Asian Heritage Festival. And what Janet did was she sensed that artists of Asian heritage were often excluded or left out of explorations with new technologies, and felt it was crucial that there be access to and experience with these tools. So together with Gisèle, we conceived a performance event that brought two artists from two different disciplines and two different cities together online in front of a live audience. And the first one was called One Moment, and it happened in May 1999. And it was more of a call and response game with the Western Front in Vancouver. We used vid phones back then, and then for the next event, we used See You, See Me. And we eventually graduated to non-proprietary systems, and then someone said one day, why don't you just use Skype? So that's what ended up happening. And in the image we have DJ, this is actually 3 artists in Montreal, DJ Mana, VJ Pillow in Montreal, and composer Lee Pui Ming in Toronto. And then the other image is of a project called Saru Powwow, which was launched on April 5th of 1997, conceived by artist Scowanati and consisting of the creation of a virtual meeting place created through a software program called Palace. It allowed for the making of a series of interconnected graphical chat rooms in which visitors could interact with one another in real time. Events were organized in artist-run centers across the country in order to bring Aboriginal people in cyberspace together across time zones to celebrate Aboriginal culture, to engage Aboriginal artists and communities with new technologies, and to make a place for the creation and sharing of art, and to support the discussion and reflection on what it means for Native people to claim and determine territory in cyberspace. So it's just important to underscore how artist-run culture was crucial for the development of this type of research creation work. So we should tie it up now, yes?
Yep.
Yeah, so we just want to talk in closing about how artist-run culture and research creation has impacted our current roles, myself as a curator and yourself as a prof. So I would just say that I really appreciate in a big way the notion of process and how it's important for a kind of long view of any project. And also I value more now than ever the importance of questioning, of questions, of defining that, seeing what's at stake, and allowing ourselves to make mistakes and take risks in order to pursue those questions.
J'adhère à ce que tu dis aussi, puis je pense que tous les rôles que j'ai joués pendant presque 30 ans maintenant, Prime, Groupe Intervention Vidéo, Oboro, Interaccess à Toronto, ont contribué directement à mon rôle de professeur, chercheur, créateur aujourd'hui, mes 2 mandats de direction à Hexagram, et je peux dire que c'est une manière de vivre la pratique. Je pense que c'est pas juste quelque chose que je fais la fin de semaine ou le soir quand il n'y a pas d'autres choses à faire. Et puis, c'est vraiment en continuité avec la collaboration à laquelle j'adhère depuis beaucoup, beaucoup d'années. Puis j'aimerais juste terminer en disant que la recherche-création, si on la pense vraiment comme étant pas une fusion, mais une manière de continuellement repenser, comme Brian Masumi et Aaron disent, really take that hyphenation seriously. Dans ces temps d'austérité, dans ces temps de coupure budgétaire, au changement du système québécois, au changement des systèmes de programme, au Conseil des arts, au calque, on doit absolument rester ouvert et solidaire de toutes nos initiatives dans le moment présent. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you to all the panelists. I know it's been a quite dense panel, but I think very important in setting some historical precedents, methodological frameworks, theoretical ideas for the next 3 days. I think we'll just take a few minutes. We're way over, but I'm sure people have questions. We'll take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll proceed to Concordia.
Everybody might be, we could, I don't know, maybe people are too tired.
There's a microphone here and over
There's
there.
a mic there, and there's a mic over there, too. And again, it's just a few questions, because I know it's been quite dense, and you're quite tired already. So.
Hello, just thank you very much for your interventions. I would like to ask a simple question. Actually, it's always nice to see what we do every day being described and analyzed so deeply, gives feedbacks and helps us to change our practice. But I was asking how it's for everybody that talked about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. Why isn't this also a discipline? I mean, because we need to form our students, we need to help them to think in between the disciplines, but isn't this already somehow the formation of a new kind of student that has to think like that, or has to have a certain reflexes to think like that?
I'd like to discuss that, because I think that a disciplinary, there's always a starting point in disciplinarity, because, for example, a painter has to know how to use the paint in order to paint, right? But eventually, and there's of course the connection with materialities that inform the discourse, you know. So it's as you're painting that you're discovering also what you're going to be doing with the painting. But ultimately, as Cheryl was saying, it's the questions that we're asking when we're painting, you know. So if we're talking a lot, I mean, I would consider painting to be a technology, because we're using paintbrushes, we're using things that are fabricated by industry, and even, you know, as Marcel Duchamp said, I mean, all paintings are ready-mades because painting comes out of the tube. But no, I think it's the most important is really it's the questioning. So if with the students you start off with a disciplinary knowing the methods of the discipline, but it's not because it's folding the discipline in. It's creating a basis from then to which to collaborate with. And so it's not one or the other. It's not either or. It's really either and. So that I think creates much more interesting problematics.
It's working? Yeah. Hi. It's a really good question, but I perhaps like Gisèle would refute the kind of premise, because in that sort of almost impossibly ambitious space of pedagogy that I described from the ACE program at Irvine, there's one thing I want to pull out, which shows that there's nothing necessary about, you know, we can't assume anything. And that is, I sort of banged on about it. I could have talked a lot more about the other elements, but the inclusion of feminist and critical STS and history of science in that pedagogy is not something we can take for granted. And I'll tell you why I know that. It's what we anthropologists do. We always compare. It's a very interesting way to find what matters. And I've been doing the last 5 years, and in the same kind of work, but in even greater depth on music and the digital, and interdisciplinarity between music and science and engineering. And I've been inside the universities looking again at training programs, PhD and master's programs. And let me tell you, I could bang the table. That stuff is not present in those trainings. It doesn't appear. So we're churning out music technology students and computer musicians who have no, I'm going to be really polemical, no critical perspective on the technologies they're using. And to me, it's astonishing, and it's incredibly problematic. And it's huge. I mean, in the UK, we turn out 10,000 of these students a year, okay, in our tiny country. And so, you know, we can't assume there's a politics of knowledge here about the pedagogies and what they contain, and we can't take it for granted. Yeah.
I think it's a very important question because, as you know, in the faculties, people have been trained in a discipline. So they have been trained in a discipline, and they have been mentally trained to transfer this discipline. So to repeat what they have learned, the way they have learned it, and so there is room for innovation or innovative pedagogical approaches, but it's not the way that the faculties are built. They are built for the transmission. If we think about, let's say, 50 years ago in a painting class, everybody had to get out of the class with exactly the same painting, the same drawing. There was the model, and there was a right way to design it, to make it, and the class was, the students were good if they make exactly a perfect replica of the model. It's no more the way we teach painting. We try to help people to have notions, ideas, criticism approaches. We invite them to look around, to find other ways, to find different models, and so on. I think that the question of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, which is a step further, is going in that, I would say, in that way. There is no more one right way to do things, but the best way is the way that opens eyes, help us to think in different ways, to find new ways of asking questions, find a direction to find solutions. Even with art, art can bring solutions. I mean, art is still very much on the step of the criticism step. I mean, find new problems. I think it's good, but there is already many problems. Maybe to find other ways to look for solutions would be also something that art can bring in. And certainly media art, because many productions in media arts are collaborative, they are done by people in different, coming from different cultures, is somewhere to look for new models. I mean, for new ways of addressing questions, addressing even the reflection about art and disciplines. But I agree that it is, and as you said, I mean, the question of the evaluation is very a crucial question. I mean, if people cannot get their tenure track, if they cannot be recognized because they are not in the strict pattern of the history of that department, which is not necessarily one discipline, it may be a few disciplines, But if the person is not, it's a very, very big challenge.
One more question from the audience? Please.
I think the question is more for Georgina. You mentioned in your presentation that some of the successful programs were actually quite experimental and that evaluation was a problem. Now, I work in a university in the United States. I work at Cornell, and we are seeing a increasing interest in quantification and prediction of outcomes. And when you're talking about an experiment, this is actually not possible. So how can we as academics and practitioners address this discrepancies between what is expected and what we think we want to do?
Well, thanks very much. It's a really interesting question you pose, and I'm sure I don't have the answer. But partly I pick up Louise's earlier point. That is, the whole point, surely, I guess it's what's meant by our agonistic, antagonistic, or logical ontology. The whole point about interdisciplinarity at the edge, transdisciplinarity, is that precisely it isn't going down known tracks. And therefore, in a way, everything is emergent, and including the criteria of evaluation. That's the problem. Bureaucracies, educational bureaucracies, professions, disciplines work with weight of history, not with what's about to become. The quantification issue seems to me, again going back to Louise, is a perfect area in which injection of art, and media art, can destabilize, hopefully, some very worrying trends of a certain kind of very rigid positivism associated with the rapid growth of enormously powerful machinic, algorithmically led quantitative modeling. And that's what I would like to see. So once again, the forefront of knowledge poses us, and particularly us gathered here today, artists interested in working with given new tools and methods, poses exactly those challenges. The challenge isn't to confirm the one area I know about, for example, to touch on another issue of interest to all of us, is the so-called digital humanities, where money is being poured in, but none of us know what it is. In musicology, the tendency is to use the computer to do really, really exhaustive, powerful historical searches across scores, texts, and so on. There's no innovation epistemologically in that, and we need to find more interesting ways to use the powers of the computer in musicology. So again, by analogy, it's, these things pose us a challenge, many challenges, not one. And that's how I would like to see, it's in a way what transdisciplinarity or strong interdisciplinarity doing is precisely destabilizing very rapidly coalescing shibboleths and kind of unchallengeable truths, usually with very powerful, machinic methods behind them.
If I can say a word, I also think that the role of the institution is very determinant. The role of the different Conseils des Arts and so on. We are at the FRQSC, we are remodeling the Recherche-Création program. By the way, all the things you quoted will be changed. And I think that it's as long as this is giving the frame work of what it will be possible to do as research creation, for instance, is a kind of designing what can be do as a research or as funded research in different institutions or by artists. I give an instance, intersectoriality is now more and more a kind of a paradigm for all the funds. I mean, they all try to find ways to facilitate, to put money together, different funds, I mean, nature and technology with art and with other, to help to improve or to facilitate the collaborations. The universities are going to be open to that. I mean, if the researchers can found research done there, then the universities maybe will have to rethink the way they evaluate professors and open a tenure track for interdisciplinary or improve or help. And I think that when I arrived to the fund 2 months ago, I did not realize that, how much it can be. Let's say, for instance, on the CV, on the, if we recognize the way that people do mobilization and open their research to a larger public, if there are points given for that, if you can get 10% of the points, I mean, then it will be important. And then the university, for the promotion, is going to look at it also in the, I mean, it's very little things because it's not a big amount of money. In my fund, it's 50,000 million per year. So, and it's not only for art, as you know. It's not a lot, but these things may have a very, very big impact on the way the curriculum of the disciplinary, the departments, and the institution, the university are going to.
I think that's an excellent place to end. Thank you all so much for your attention this afternoon. Thank the panelists.